Welcome to the Modern Mexico Podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. On today's podcast, we're talking about tequila. Mexico's tequila industry is a booming sector that is centered in the state of Jalisco. Tequila exports tallied over $3.5 billion in 2025. Tequila is traditionally made by chopping down spiky agave plants, roasting the heavy cores, and mashing the sweet-smelling pumpkin orange pulp for fermentation and distillation. It's now one of Mexico's most iconic products. On today's podcast, we're speaking to Ted Genoways, the author of the new book, Tequila Wars, Jose Cuervo and the Bloody Struggle for Mexico's Spirit. Hi, Ted. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start off by asking you, why did you pick Jose Cuervo to be the central character of your story?
Yeah, so initially my plan was to write a book about the contemporary tequila industry, and I wrote some magazine articles. I went to Mexico to do some research trips for a book in that direction. And I guess the thing that I started to realize was first that the modern industry is so much in flux that it was going to be tough to write a book that I felt like, would be relevant for more than a short period after it came out. And I also thought that there were other people who were doing a really good job of covering some of the parts of the industry that interested me most. Clayton Sheck, with his field guide to tequila, did an amazing job of kind of covering the technical side. Sarah Bowen, with her book Divided Spirits, did a fantastic job of covering stuff with the humidors and sort of the field aspect. So that felt like it was done to me. But what I didn't see was a book that really focused on the history of the industry, and especially in terms of the families and how the industry had interacted with Mexican history writ large. When I asked some of the families, what do you have in the way of resources on your own family's history? What everyone kept telling me was that all of that history was lost, that so many of the records had been intentionally destroyed, burned by revolutionaries during the Mexican Revolution, and that in the years following the revolution, because of all the people who had been put on trial for letters that they had sent or records that they had kept, that people had for 100 years after been extremely cautious about putting anything down. And so what they kept saying was there's no way to recover this history. Now, I suspected that wasn't true. And as I got to digging through government archives, I started to find traces here and there. And what I saw was that, especially in that crucial period right before and during the Mexican Revolution, it was Jose Cuervo, the man who was always sort of at the lead and the person who was interfacing with the government and trying to lobby the government, but also then at times backing different revolutionary movements, always with an eye toward advancing the industry. And so from a narrative standpoint, this is great. This is a name that everyone knows. There's no one else in the industry who we know first name, last name like this, especially in pop culture. But also, he came from a very old tequila making family, which gave me the opportunity to talk about that deep history. But his father had really lost everything, just as Jose was becoming a teenager. And so as an adult, he is a self-made man. He is rebuilding the family legacy, but he is also doing that by being at the forefront of innovation and anticipating all of the sort of big political and technological changes in the country and in the industry. So, he becomes the central figure for me, really because historically he was at the center of that transformation.
So I think that Jose Cuervo definitely lived during a very fascinating time in Mexican history, and your book really brings that history to life through the perspective, the lens of the tequila industry. And I really think that out of all the books that I've talked about so far on the podcast, Tequila Wars is really unique because it is about historical events from over 100 years ago, but it reads like it's freshly reported narrative nonfiction. And I think you did a really great job of bringing your historical research to life and in telling the story in a really engaging way. And with that in mind, I wanted to ask you about the political context of this era that you wrote about. And what three words would you pick to describe the context in Mexico during the Porfirio Diaz era as Jose Cuervo is trying to build up his business?
Okay, yeah. So this is a great question, a tricky one. But it seems really appropriate to me. I mean, Diaz himself uh, was, a great sloganeer and really understood the power of being able to reduce big political concepts and movements um, down to just a few words. But I give space in the book to his slogan of fair elections or fair voting, no reelection, because it's something that then gets picked up by the revolutionaries later on. But there are other examples, which is things like pan o palo or orden y progreso, which is basically bread or the stick, and order and progress, and the whole idea was to give a few words that people could rally around. Um, and at the height of that Porfirian age, many of the distilleries in tequila, were either being founded and given names that reflected that philosophy, or they renamed themselves during that time. And so you get Jesus Flores with his distillery La Constancia. You get Zenobio Sousa founding La Perseverancia. You get Fortaleza, which is still there and owned by Guillermo Erickson Sousa. Um, but if you think about it, then to get back to your question, the reason that everybody is emphasizing these kinds of virtues, perseverance, constancy, fortitude, they're doing that because the country was in such upheaval. And I think that upheaval, as I think about it, it's this tension that exists in Mexico, and as you say, it's still the case that it exists between growth, what Diaz called progress, but really economic growth, but then also the graft that was often working against that growth. So that's a little bit of buying time, but so the words that I would use, so internationalization, um, and maybe graft, and then inequality. And I would say that because Diaz starts out, builds his government by trying to court foreign wealth and using that money from Europe and from the United States to build Mexico. But then as that money comes flowing into the country, and so that's the internationalization part, to court that foreign money. But as the contracts are being handed out, and the leases are being made, and payouts are being paid, all of that money is only going to Diaz's inner circle. And so it becomes a culture of graft. And that cronyism eventually produces such disparity in the culture and in the economy of Mexico that, to my mind, that is when revolution really becomes inevitable. You can't have a system where there's this very small elite that enjoys unbelievable wealth, and then the people who produce that wealth live in abject poverty. Eventually, they rise up, and they did.
So, internationalization, graft, and inequality. I definitely think that
Yes.
those are very helpful for understanding some of the context and thinking about how this authoritarian government was nominally pro-business and worked to attract investment, but it also really created a political environment that posed serious challenges for entrepreneurs and investors. And I recently looked at some of the historical data on GDP growth during the 19th century in Mexico, and I saw that between 1810 and 1877, Mexico's economy actually contracted by over 10%. And
Um,
on the other hand, during the Porfiriato, Mexico did experience a new boom of investment, and as investment and exports grew, Mexico's economy expanded by over 2% per year on average. So that does seem like a positive change in some respects. But on the other hand, we also know that by 1900, wealth was very concentrated, and the top 10% most affluent families in Mexico controlled over three-quarters of all of the wealth in Mexico. And I think that your story really illustrates how the Porfiriato era in Mexico was all about crony capitalism and how political and business elites were able to conspire together to build an extractive system in which political interference, lobbying, and corruption were kind of seen as the norm.
yeah.
And on episode 29 of the podcast, we talked about the book Why Nations Fail, and we looked into Mexico's history of institutional weakness. And when I was reading your book, I definitely had that kind of institutional framework in mind. And I think that what you really show is that the Porfirian era was really not an easy and predictable climate for operating a business, and it might
Yeah.
kind of poke holes in the somewhat simple narrative that Porfirio Diaz was, good for investment or good for business in Mexico. And with that in mind, I wanted to ask that when you look at the Jose Cuervo story, what were the biggest obstacles that Cuervo faced as he sought to build up his company?
Yeah, well, so first, just as exactly as you say, Diaz is probably his greatest visible legacy is that he was known as the railroad builder, and that essentially there was no infrastructure of that sort to move goods around to within the Mexico's borders, but certainly then not to the northern border, which was so crucial for the economy. He built those railroads, no question about it. And that was good for the economy. He also protected those railroads by ordering that if anyone did damage to the railroad tracks, revolutionaries, anti government factions of any sort, they were to be killed and strung up in a place that was visible for everyone to see by sundown, or he was going to send in the army to execute the mayor of the town. And that kind of rule, it is it effective for business? I mean, it certainly protects the infrastructure, but as you say, it also creates this kind of constant culture of fear and chaos, and also you can only repress these kinds of movements for so long. And yes, Jose Cuervo himself makes for a fascinating historical example of this because I guess to explain, he takes over the company that he regains by marriage in 1900 and takes over the distillery La Rojena, which is still the kind of flagship of the industry in the town of Tequila in 1900. and then Cuervo himself lives to January of 1921. So it's a fairly neat 20-year career that is divided evenly between the years leading up to the revolution and the revolution itself. So when he took over the company in 1900, we're in those waning days of Diaz's rule, and you see Cuervo having to make his way to the center of that crony capitalistic system, that if you're not in the inner circle, you're not going to benefit. But he's also making all kinds of calculations, using that political influence to set up who will succeed Diaz, and prepare for the moment where he is inevitably either ousted or he dies. And so all of that effort for 10 years goes into maintaining peace and anticipating a peaceful transition. But then in 1910, having gained all that political power and gotten to the center of Diaz's circle, it's really too late. And as Diaz is about to be toppled, we see Cuervo building new alliances and then even backing revolutionary movements, and spending that second decade of his career just trying to keep his business afloat, but also trying to keep his family alive, as there's this kind of constant revolving cast of leaders who are coming in and burning tequila and toppling the government in Guadalajara, and all of the destruction to infrastructure that comes with that. And all that he's trying to do is make sure that his business survives, but not being too closely allied with one side or the other in a way that would put him in front of a firing squad if he guesses wrong.
So it seems like overall, through kind of both chapters of his business career, the biggest obstacle that he faced was political risk. And one idea that your book really brings to life is the idea that in an environment of weak rule of law, the only way that companies can really defend themselves enough to be able to survive and grow um, is to consolidate a significant market share for themselves. And in a unpredictable and politically complicated environment, we see that successful firms need to consolidate both market power and political power. And I thought that it was really interesting to read about the lengths that these tequila companies had to go to establish themselves and become strong enough to survive for so long. And I know that your story brings us through the tail end of the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship and into its um, chaotic, chaotic transition into the
Yeah.
Mexican Revolution. And I wanted to ask you, how did the Mexican Revolution end up impacting the tequila sector?
Yeah, well, it was devastating to the industry, and from a physical standpoint, just as I was describing before, I mean, the town of Tequila itself was raided by revolutionaries. It was cannonaded and burned multiple times. You get the telegraph lines cut. You get the telephones and electricity severed. But worse still for the broader industry, the fields of agave were burned in order to try to extort money out of the owners. And without going into too much detail, I mean, the agave is a very difficult plant that takes 7 to 10 years to mature. So if you at that time are burning a field of agave, you're taking out raw material for a decade. And then the other primary tool of the revolutionaries was dynamiting those railroad lines that Diaz had built in order to cut off being able to move troops around. but that also means that you can't move your tequila around or any other products. And so, 10 years of that resulted in I mean, a near total destruction of the tequila industry. In 1905, when the government was recording the state of the tequila industry, it notes that there were 167 tequila distilleries in the state of Jalisco at that time. By 1918, less than 15 years later, tail end of the war, there are just four distilleries in tequila, and they are divided between the Cuervo and Sauza families. And then there are a few small distilleries that are scattered around the Tequila Valley. Some we would recognize the Rosales family that was behind Herradura, which was being founded right at that time, coming out of an older brand. Buda de Martinez, which is making a resurgence right now. But I mean, we've gone from pushing up toward 200 distilleries to maybe a dozen statewide. And so there's a great anecdote about this moment in early 1919 when President Carranza announces that he's going to rebuild Mexico by having a year of rebuilding that is fueled by steep taxes on industry. And Jose Cuervo and Eladio Souza go together to Mexico City to lobby Carranza not to impose those taxes on tequila because they are just barely able to keep their distilleries open as it is. And they call on Manuel Dieguez, who was originally from Tequila, had been the governor of Jalisco and was about to be Carranza's Secretary of War for the tail end of the revolution. They asked him to write a letter on their behalf to Carranza. And in describing the state of the industry, Dieguez says that the town and the distilleries and the industry itself have been damaged to the point of disappearance. And I think that that's really the kind of surprising takeaway for me from all of this is that this became the moment that tequila emerged as an international product through cooperation, through seeing a different kind of model that they needed to follow. But had they decided to do things even slightly differently, I think it's entirely possible that we wouldn't know the name tequila at all.
So I think that when you write about this chapter of Mexican history, you do a really great job of explaining and narrating the complex web of characters and plot lines that occurred during the Mexican Revolution. And I think that overall, in pop culture, this chapter of Mexican history is still widely celebrated in Mexico today. And in the decades after the Mexican Revolution, some things changed, but some trends in Mexico have really continued. And I think that when it comes to operating a business in Mexico, political risk and legal uncertainty are still very important factors that executives and investors need to consider. And I saw that in the 2025 World Justice Project Rule of Law Index, Mexico comes in at 121 out of 143 countries. So among the worst in the world when it comes to rule of law. And Mexico is also ranked as the third worst country in the world in terms of organized crime activity. So, in some ways, the challenges facing
Yeah.
businesses in Mexico today in terms of dealing with limited state capacity, corrupt government officials, and groups of heavily armed bandits may be similar to some of the situations that you describe in your book. And I know that you said you had the chance to visit Jalisco while working on research about tequila, and I wanted to ask from your perspective, how do the dynamics in the tequila industry today compare to the era that you wrote about in the book?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so one thing, yes, I researched this book over more than a decade and made I I don't know how many trips to the town of Tequila and to the region, and had the chance on several occasions to spend kind of large blocks of time, which is really helpful. The first thing that I think is surprising, and I wouldn't have assumed, is that so many of these recognizable tequila brands are still headquartered in this town of Tequila, which is maybe it's about 25,000 people, and in a fairly rural setting. It's maybe an hour and a half outside of Guadalajara. And in that town, you've got Guillermo Erickson Sousa with Fortaleza at the southern edge of town, and then the Beckman family, which is descendants of Jose Cuervo, they still run La Rojena. The front door faces right out onto the plaza, and their home is close there. And in between those two distilleries, those Sausa and Cuervo distilleries, there's Tequileño that is run by the Saez Cuervo family, which is the branch of the family that intermarried with the Southern Pacific agent who brought the railroad to Tequila. The Orendine family has Arete at El Llano, that distillery there. And so the old families are still right there. They are side by side. And in many ways, the place would be pretty recognizable to people who had been there certainly 100, but maybe even as much as 150 years ago. What has really changed is that in those early years, there was such bitter rivalry among those families, and being so tightly packed together, there was a lot of violence and conflict. But something that came out of the revolution and this model of cooperation that got them through that period and into the modern era, that has really taken hold. And the brands now, they are all part of the tequila chamber. They work together to manage everything from agave crops and fighting blights and pests, to working together to develop export markets and infrastructure projects. And so it really is the modern tequila industry that Jose Cuervo envisioned. But as you say, unfortunately, it is also a world of corruption and of threats that I think Jose Cuervo would recognize as well. And those threats, the thing that's so challenging for everyone in Mexico is that one threat is the government, the other threat is organized crime and the cartels. And very often they are one and the same. They work in unison. And so many people may know about the recent flare-up of violence in Guadalajara and around Jalisco after the government took down and killed El Mencho, the head of the New Generation cartel in Jalisco. What people may not know is that it was right around that same time, just a little bit before that the mayor of Tequila was arrested. Many of the members of the city council were removed. They did an internal audit and ended up removing large numbers of the local police force because they were all allegedly working with the cartel to extort business owners in town. And exactly as you say, I mean, it is just incredibly difficult in a country where this is the environment to get ahead in the business world. You're constantly at odds with one form of authority or another, the government or the cartels, and they both have their hands in your pockets. And so, the unity that the industry has developed, I think, has gotten them through, but it remains a united front kind of out of necessity.
So I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that issue of extortion in the town of Tequila. And I think that's definitely an example of the risks that companies continue to face in Jalisco in particular and in Mexico more generally. And I thought it could be fun to do a little comparison in between the situation in the tequila producing region and the situation in the countries that are buying the most
Mm.
tequila. And I looked at the stats for raising tax revenue, and I know that the US is the top export market for tequila. And when it comes to tax revenue, the US is able to collect over a quarter of its GDP in taxes, around 27%. And Germany is the number two buyer of tequila, and Germany brings in around a third of GDP in taxes. And Italy is also in the top 10 top buyers of tequila, and Italy collects nearly 43% of its GDP in taxes. And that's a pretty stark comparison to Mexico. I know that Mexico brings in less than a fifth of its GDP in taxes. And in relative terms, it means that Mexico is bringing in tax revenue that is quite a bit lower than the US and significantly lower than in Germany or Italy. And beyond that, Mexico's tax take is also lower than most other Latin American countries. So I don't think it's an accident that this problem of limited state presence in rural Jalisco, was happening a century ago and is still happening today. One of the big problems in Mexico continues to be limited state capacity, weak institutions, and high levels of organized crime activity. And you mentioned the chaos following the El Mencho operation, and on episode 30 of the podcast, we talked about the current dynamics of organized crime in Jalisco, and I definitely encourage any listeners who want to hear more about what's happening in Jalisco today to check out that episode. But overall, we know that Jalisco is now the main base for one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico. And in recent years, we've seen videos circulating online of caravans of dozens of heavily armed gunmen from the new generation Jalisco cartel who are riding around in military style vehicles with flak jackets and big machine guns on rural roads in Jalisco. And in some ways, I think that these commandos from the CNGJ might be the modern version of some of the groups of gunmen that you write about. And I also know that in the last few years, there have been several cases of gunmen hijacking tequila shipments. And in 2025, there was one case where armed men strong-armed a tequila delivery at a toll booth on the Mexico-Guadalajara highway. And that might be a version of an incident that you could imagine happening, during the Mexican Revolution. And overall, this area of central Mexico is actually the highest risk zone in the country for cargo theft. So it's kind of a really stark contrast. So over the last 100 years, the state of Jalisco has continued to industrialize. It's built up on the base that was established by Jose Cuervo and other entrepreneurs. And today, the capital city of Jalisco, Guadalajara, is really a modern, successful urban economy. But this continued threat from cartel gunmen is really a reminder that some of that lawlessness that you describe in your book continues to exist in rural Jalisco and other surrounding states in Mexico. And before we close up, I do have one more question for you, which is, over the course of working on research for this book, did you get the chance to drink any particular glass of tequila that really stands out to you?
Thank you for the, because this is a tough topic, and I do appreciate ending on something that reminds us of why we go to all of this trouble, which is this remarkable spirit that is produced in tequila. And in 12 years and now additional years since the book has come out, of spending a lot of time there are certainly a lot of bottles that I've become very fond of. I am a serious lover of tequila. Um, but I think there are two bottles that would kind of stand out as bookends on my journey with this project. And the first was tasting Fortaleza at the distillery in the cave on the estate, where Guillermo Erickson Sousa, the owner, entertains guests. Um, the tequila itself is fantastic, and I love all the tequilas that they produce. Um, and it was a real gateway for me, and it was in one of those early conversations with Guillermo that he talked about getting this estate and a distillery that had gone defunct on his family land, getting it back up and running, and and he had made this first batch, this kind of test batch with agaves grown right there on the estate, and made in the brick ovens and milled with the volcanic millstone, the Dona, and then open fermentation in the giant wooden pipones, the wooden vats that are there, and distilled in these copper pots that had belonged to his great grandfather. And Guillermo said that, like, as the second distillation on that batch came out, and they were getting the first trickle of this tequila, at still strength and hot from the still, and tasted that, he said that he had this sudden moment of realization that this was a particular flavor that no one had tasted in 100 years. And I think that statement may be the thing that set me on this journey with this book, was like thinking about the processes and how they are a reflection of the time, and how flavors are reflections not only of terroir and of process as we tend to think of it, but also of business forces and political pressures. And it's such a taste of its moment in history. And that brings me to the second bottle. I'm really pleased that Jose Cuervo is just rolling out this fall a new product that they called 1908. It is called that because Jose Cuervo registered his label and his product, his name, in 1908, just as the railroad was about to arrive in Tequila, and he was about to start shipping his product across Mexico and into the United States. And so this was the moment that his tequila was about to become a widely distributed product. And the folks at Cuervo, led by master distiller Alejandro Coronado, they set out, and I'm really thrilled to say, with some inspiration from the book and direction from the book, to try to match Jose Cuervo's production methods, and recognizing that they had these resources at hand, that the agave comes from Jose Cuervo's own estates. They're baked in the ovens that were designed by his brother-in-law and installed by Cuervo, distilled in copper pot stills like the ones that he used. And the tequila that they've produced, this Blanco, this 1908 Blanco, is really, I think, wonderful. And again, it's such a reflection of its time and of the particular the land and the processes that are deployed there at La Rojena. And so, one of the great pleasures for me after the book came out, and everybody has been so celebratory and welcoming for me, and I got to spend one afternoon in Tequila with Juan Domingo Beckman, the CEO at Cuervo, and Guillermo Erickson Sausa from Fortaleza, each of them drinking each other's tequila and talking family history. And to me, it was a remarkable moment to be able to taste Fortaleza and the Cuervo 1908 side by side, to get a little bit of a glimpse of what the tequila tasted like that the Cuervo and the Sausa families were making at that moment at the end of the revolution, when the industry was reborn. And those flavors, those bottles, they're so distinct, but they are, to me, they are a physical manifestation of that shared past and this future that they are embarking on together as well.
So that's really interesting. It sounds like for you, the most memorable glasses of tequila that you've had are really connected to the history of production of tequila in Jalisco. And it's interesting that you've mentioned Guillermo from Fortaleza, because a few years ago I had the chance to travel to Jalisco to meet up with Guillermo at the Fortaleza distillery and to sample a few glasses of tequila with him. And I'd probably agree with you and say that visit probably has to be the most memorable experience I've had of visiting a distillery and getting to see the big stone mill in action, crushing agave in a way that members of the family have been doing for 5 generations.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to know that, a lot of this history that you wrote about in the book is very much still alive today in terms of the companies that are operating, but also in terms of the people who are active in the sector and the families that are working in the sector. And in any case, it's been really interesting to hear your perspective. And again, I just want to say how much I enjoyed your book. And I want to say thanks so much for joining us today on the Modern Mexico podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
I wanted to take a short break to remind listeners that I'm always interested in connecting with executives and entrepreneurs who are trying to understand modern Mexico. I'm available to provide custom briefings on politics, public policy issues, and security problems in different parts of Mexico. So if you're interested in speaking to me, please don't hesitate to reach out. If you like what you heard on the podcast today, check out my book, Searching for Modern Mexico, which is available on Amazon. The next episode of the podcast is coming soon. Until then, hasta luego, amigos.